When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
The reign of Madison, like of Bonaparte, may be considered as at an end. The Evening Star in Britain.
After 25 years of the fiercest warfare in which every great capital of Europe had been spared, almost respected by enemies, it was reserved for England to violate all that decent courtesy towards the seats of national dignity. Representative Jared Ingersoll.
There's scarcely a metropolis in Europe that has not been taken in the course of the last 20 years. There's not a single instance in all that time of public buildings like those being destroyed. John Quincy Adams to Louisa Catherine Adams, 7th of October, 1814.
George Washington founded this city after a 7 years' war with England. James Madison lost it after a 2 years' war. Graffiti in Washington, D.C. following the invasion.
Washington, D.C. was ablaze. The government's officers were scattered. The British were still on the loose. Undoubtedly, August 25th, 1814 was the lowest point of the Madison presidency to that date, and Americans in the area could only wonder just how much worse it would get, and if it would ever get better for them. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Before we pick back up where we left off, I'd like to take a moment to thank a few podcasting friends for providing the intro quotes for this episode. First, my friends Chris and Elsa are the hosts of A Flat Pack History of Sweden. Since 2020, with each episode, they have guided the audience through the story of how the land now known as the Kingdom of Sweden came to be. Starting in the prehistoric era, their meticulous journey through this rich history is filled with fascinating characters and events. Whether you have a great appreciation of Scandinavian history or you're starting at square one, there's no better partners on the journey through the annals than Elsa and Chris. So go to aflatpackhistoryofsweden.com or just search for A Flat Pack History of Sweden wherever you get your podcast to check out their work. Peter Zablocki and I just had the opportunity to meet this year. But since then, we've had some fantastic conversations, and I always look forward to seeing where Peter's inquiries into the past are going to lead him in the latest episode of his podcast, History Shorts. In just a few minutes, Peter breaks down the ins and outs of the who, what, when, where, and why of various points and characters in history. Recent topics have included the mummification of Lenin, the Teapot Dome scandal, Marilyn Monroe's death, and White House ghosts. You can go to historyshortspodcast.com to learn more, or just search for History Shorts wherever fine podcasts can be found. Last but certainly not least, Roberto Toro is the host of not one, but two podcasts. His original podcast, The History of Sarkovello, Georgia, explores the rich history and culture of the nation of Georgia in the Caucasus Mountains at the intersection of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Speaking as someone with little knowledge of that part of the world prior to listening to his podcast, Roberto does a wonderful job of sharing with his audience the various fascinating historical figures and cultural components that led up to the present day. You can find more on this podcast at History of Sarkovello, that's SAQARTVELO.com. His second podcast, Czar Power, examines the life and legacy of all the Russian leaders from Rurik to Putin. It is currently on a temporary hiatus, which is the perfect time to get caught up on all the episodes that have come out to date. From the Varangian rulers of Kiev to the Russian Federation, this journey through Russian history is one not to be missed. You can find more information on this podcast at Tsar, that's TSAR, powerpod.weebly.com. I'll have links to all these podcasts on my website, which is presidenciespodcast.com, so be sure to check them out once you're done with this episode. Speaking of, after a brief message, we'll continue on with our narrative.
Have you ever wondered why we call French fries, or why something is the greatest thing since sliced bread? There are answers to those questions. Everything Everywhere Daily is a podcast for curious people who want to learn more about the world around them. Every day, you'll learn something new about things you never knew you didn't know. Subjects include history, science, geography, mathematics, and culture. If you're a curious person and want to learn more about the world you live in, just subscribe to Everything Everywhere Daily wherever you cast your pod.
We left on a bit of a cliffhanger last episode. August 24th had ended with President Madison, Attorney General Richard Rush, and General John Mason riding around Northern Virginia, ultimately stopping for the evening at the home of the Reverend John Maffitt. His wife Dolly, meanwhile, was just a mile away from him. The next day, though Madison and his party started out early, they had to take refuge in the midst of the furious storm that drove the British from Washington, D.C. But they finally arrived at Wiley's Tavern, which is where the president had sent word to the First Lady to meet them. One can only imagine James's relief to see Dolly safe and sound at the tavern. The president could not stay for long. Rumors were flying fast, and one made its way to Madison that the British were headed their way. Thus, he and his enlarged party, having been joined by Secretary of the Navy William Jones, who had been at the tavern with his family, set out at midnight to cross over into Maryland. But, finding the river impassable due to the heavy rainfall that day, making it more treacherous, they decided to wait until the morning. Finally able to cross the Potomac, they pushed on through the day to catch up with General Winder's force in what is now known as Rockville, only to find when they arrived there that Winder had moved on to Baltimore. More on that in a moment. The party then went on to Brookville, where they stayed at a home where, quote, beds were spread in the parlor for them. Before retiring for the evening, Madison sent a message to his chief intelligence officer, also known as Secretary of State James Monroe, for an update, as well as orders to Secretary of the Treasury George Campbell and Secretary of War John Armstrong to reconvene in the nation's capital city as soon as possible. The next morning, Saturday, August 27th, brought confirmation that the British were gone from Washington, and so Madison, after sending off a quick message to Dolly asking her to meet him there, set off for the District of Columbia. By 5 that evening, the president returned to the Capitol to find many government buildings, including the U.S. Capitol and the President's House, in ruins. He would spend the evening with his in-laws, former Representative Richard Cutts and Anna Payne Cutts, who lived in the home that had been occupied by the Madisons while James had served as Secretary of State back in the day. Dolly found her way back to her husband's side before long, but not before witnessing firsthand the ire of people in the area. Supposedly, she stopped at a house at one point in her journey, only to have the mistress of the house yell to her, quote, Miss Madison, if that's you, your husband's got mine out fighting, and damn you, you shan't stay in my house, so get out. By the point she was heading back to Washington, Dolly had taken to disguising herself, quote, wearing the shawl of a simple farmer's wife, but had to reveal her identity to a colonel guarding a ferry across the river in order to gain passage. Finally, though, James and Dolly were reunited once more so that they could survey the damage at the president's house. When they arrived, they found that the only thing that remained of the structure was, quote, its cracked and blackened walls. One can only imagine how emotional of a moment this was for a couple who had, for 5.5 years, occupied this house. A shell of a building in a shell of a city. William Wirt visited President Madison around this time and described him as, quote, miserably shattered and woebegone. In short, he looks heartbroken. Meanwhile, Margaret Bayard Smith visited with Dolly and found her, quote, much depressed. She could scarcely speak without tears. The Madisons, however, were not alone in their grief. Other residents of the district had fled the British invasion and, after finally getting to return from their displacement in temporary shelters, had to face the destruction of many of the key buildings in the city, as well as the prospect of trying to put their lives back in order. The president could not wallow in his grief, however. The nation needed him. The United States was in a low place. All banks outside of New England, as well as some in that region, had been forced in August 1814 to suspend repaying their bills in specie, or hard currency, which was sending the nation's economy into freefall. Speaking of New England, as mentioned in episode 4.33, and is going to be discussed in further detail next episode, rumblings of disunion were growing, something that Madison was beginning to direct his focus and anger towards. The more immediate concern, however, was that the British force was still somewhere in the Chesapeake area, and it was a safe bet that they weren't done yet. Before he could address that situation, though, President Madison had to tend to his own house, as it were. On August 29th, 5 days after the city had been set ablaze, Madison mounted his horse that evening and went to the lodgings of Secretary of War John Armstrong once he received word that Armstrong was back in town. As Madison described later, quote, I observed to him that he could not be unaware of the great excitement in the district produced by the unfortunate event which had taken place in the city. That was an understatement. The militia of Washington, D.C. had held a meeting the night before and, quote, adopted a resolution denouncing Armstrong as the willing cause of the destruction of Washington, and they further pledged they would no longer serve under his orders. Armstrong had lost the confidence not just of the nation's military forces, but also of the commander-in-chief. According to Madison, he shared with the secretary that he felt that Armstrong had not, quote, done all that ought to have been done, and in proper time. Armstrong tried to defend himself, but Madison was having none of that. The secretary offered to either resign or, quote, retire from the scene for a while and visit his family in New York. For some reason, Madison did not accept Armstrong's resignation, and the next day, the embattled secretary left Washington, bound for the Empire State. He didn't get as far as Baltimore before he saw fit send a letter to be published in the Baltimore Patriot, where he not only defended his actions leading up to the burning of Washington, but also to blame the troops who had fought at Bladensburg for not being, quote, faithful to themselves and to their country. It was not a good look, and the next day, Armstrong sent his official resignation to Madison. This time, the president did not hesitate to accept it. With Madison's trusted lieutenant, James Monroe, in place as acting Secretary of War, the Virginians had to turn their attention to dealing with the anticipated attack by the British on Baltimore. While Admiral Cochrane took some time before deciding on Baltimore as his next target, the people of Baltimore and government of Maryland had been working on their defenses for a year since the British began their raids in the Chesapeake. Samuel Smith, yes, that same Samuel Smith, who was the brother of former cabinet member Robert Smith and who had been one of the leaders of the opposition to the Madison administration in the Senate, had been assigned as the local militia commander in Baltimore, quote, to assume responsibility for improving the city's inadequate defenses. A key point in making Baltimore more defensible was making improvements to Fort McHenry. This key strategic fort, positioned on the northwest branch of the Patapsco River, leading into Baltimore's harbor, was originally constructed from 1799 to 1805 and, quote, was a pentagon with 5 bastions, which gave it the shape of a 5-pointed star. Originally commissioned with 30 guns, in 1814, quote, a water battery was added that had heavy French naval guns, including some 36-pounders, and a boom consisting of ship's masts fastened together was laid to block the 600-yard wide harbor entrance between the fort and Lazaretto Point. 4 other fortifications also served to augment the harbor's defenses, and Smith prepared land defenses should, as was the case with Washington, troops be landed farther away and marched to the city. The leaders of Maryland were taking no chances. Technically, General William Winder of the Battle of Bladensburg infamy, as discussed last episode, should have been in charge of the forces in Baltimore, as it was part of the 10th Military District. However, the top military commanders in the city made it known that they favored General Samuel Smith serving as the overall commander of operations, and Maryland Governor Levin Winder, General Winder's father, agreed. The justification was that the War Department calling up General Samuel Smith and his militia force to federal service meant that Smith now outranked General Winder. And though the younger Winder was not pleased, he ultimately decided not to contest. Considering that his father had signed off on the decision, though, as Smith biographer Frank A. Castle notes, he really didn't have any leverage to negotiate. Still, one can imagine that this did nothing for the father-son relationship. Unlike what General Winder had experienced with Armstrong, with Monroe as Secretary of War, General Smith was provided with whatever resources and support that could come from the War Department. Indeed, while the situation in Baltimore was still uncertain, according to his biographer Ammon, quote, Monroe slept on a camp bed in his office to be on hand to receive reports, which arrived at all hours. Finally, the American defenders in the area began to see action by the British. On September 10th, observers reported, quote, as British warships scouted the mouth of the Patapsco. The next day, they went further, and warships and transports were spotted, quote, anchored off North Point. Smith had anticipated this move, and thus was not surprised when British ground forces disembarked at North Point. British General Robert Ross would find the American defenders that they were faced with as they marched towards Baltimore much more capable and organized than what they had seen at Bladensburg. Indeed, as Ross went to issue orders to redirect his main force in order to compensate for the heavy resistance that they met that afternoon, Ross was shot in his arm and chest and died while being transported to seek medical treatment. While the British pushed forward, the American forces were able to accomplish their goal of delaying them before withdrawing to regroup and prepare to take up the assault once more should the British try to proceed towards Baltimore. Meanwhile, Admiral Cochrane ordered an all-out assault on the harbor defenses, including Fort McHenry. However, as the river was so shallow, he was only able to get 1 frigate, 1 rocket-firing ship, and 5 bomb ships into place to attack the force. The firing started on the morning of September 13th and continued on throughout the day and into the night. In the early morning of the 14th, Cochrane ordered a force to attempt to attack the fort from its landward side, but the boats sent for the assault ended up drifting towards awaiting American forces, and thus they abandoned the mission. Finally, the British gave up. Fort McHenry and the other harbor defenses were not falling. With those forces still in place, there was little that the ground forces could do, and thus, after failing in an attempt to draw the Americans out into the open, on the 15th, the British began their retreat, and British operations in the Chesapeake came to an end. As noted by historian Charles P. Niemeyer, quote, the resolute defense surprised British commanders who had come to expect easy victories, and proved that American regulars and militiamen, when ably led and adequately trained, were equal to the soldiers of the British Empire. It also helped that, around the same time, American forces to the north were repulsing another British assault. Control of Lake Champlain, situated on the border of New York, Vermont, and modern-day Quebec, was seen as being strategically advantageous to launching land operations either further north for the Americans or further south for the British. As described by historian Walter Borman, quote, the balance of naval power on Lake Champlain had rested with the United States until June 1813, when the overzealous Lieutenant Sidney Smith caused the sloops Growler and Eagle to be lost to the British. This left the Americans to retreat to the upper end of the lake and frantically set about building new ships. When the USS Saratoga was launched on April 11, 1814, the Americans were ready to match the British challenge, which came when the HMS Confiance was launched in late August. A new British commander, Captain George Downey, assumed command of the Confiance while it was still being worked on after its launch. He wasn't even able to settle in good before he started to face pressure from British Governor of the Canadas, Sir George Prevost, to take his force into action. As noted by Borman, Prevost was considering leading a force against American troops in the area under the command of General Alexander Macomb, but felt that the naval forces on Lake Champlain needed to be put into action first. Quote, just why Sir George Prevost was so determined to wait for the Royal Navy and have Downey sail into this hornet's nest is debatable. Certainly, his army of more than 10,000 veterans should have been easily able to steamroller over Macomb's troops, no matter how effective their breastworks above the Saranac may have been. Given Downey's youth and inexperience, he was worn down, and in the early morning of September 11th, his small squadron set out. When they met up with the American squadron, it was an absolute disaster. Downey was killed in the engagement along with 56 others, while 72 British were injured, and the Americans captured 17 British officers and around 300 British seamen. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning a little bit, but a couple of X factors remained. How fast would more British reinforcements of hardened veterans of the Napoleonic Wars be coming from Europe? And could the peace negotiations be concluded before they arrived and were put into the field against the nascent American military? Turning to the second question, when last we left the American Peace Commissioners in episode 4.32, Albert Gallatin and James Bayard had grown tired of cooling their heels literally in St. Petersburg and made their way to Amsterdam to either be poised to go into direct negotiations with the British or to make their way back to the States. Though initially the word from Washington of the new commission to negotiate directly with the British did not have Gallatin included in the mix, they soon got clarification that President Madison, realizing that Gallatin intended to stay in Europe rather than return to the U.S. to take back charge of the Treasury Department, had named him as the fifth commissioner. While waiting for their colleagues to join them, Bayard and Gallatin traveled to England in April 1814 in order to get a feel for the British position. What they learned wasn't good. Given Napoleon's recent downfall, the British were feeling more confident that they were in the stronger position against the Americans now that they could direct more resources away from Europe into North America. Thus, when the British government asked them to shift the location of the negotiations from Madison's preferred locale of Göteborg, Sweden, to somewhere a bit closer, the Americans agreed without hesitation. Word was sent to their three colleagues to assemble at a town in Belgium called Ghent. Henry Clay and Jonathan Russell arrived in Sweden on April 13th. While Russell had to travel to Stockholm to assume his post as U.S. Minister to Sweden, Clay used the opportunity to make excursions from Göteborg while waiting for the negotiations to begin. By the end of May, John Quincy Adams joined Russell in Stockholm, and it would be there that the two received a letter from Clay informing them of the change of venue to Ghent. Clay opted to travel overland via Copenhagen and Hamburg, while Adams and Russell would make their way to the Low Countries by ship. Gallatin would be a little delayed, being the last American commissioner to arrive on July 7th. But even with his late arrival, the negotiations still could not begin, as their British counterparts had still not arrived. While waiting for the folks on the other side of the negotiating table, the American commissioners tried to settle into their new lodgings. They initially tried to all live together, but as noted by historian Robert Remini, quote, here were 5 highly individualistic, highly opinionated, highly dissimilar, and singularly egotistical public servants, all congregated within a confined area, and each following his own perceived notion of what constituted the best treaty for the United States. As described by historian Bernard Perkins, quote, the temporary bachelors grated upon one another. They disagreed about housing, had differing views about diplomatic protocol, and even quarreled when Ghent's Society of Fine Arts and Letters offered membership to only 3 of them. They would find that they had very different habits. As Adams' biographer James Trollope notes, quote, Adams was a man of settled habits, not at all accustomed to adjusting his daily routine to suit others. As the other commissioners preferred to eat later, Adams often ate by himself. Likewise, some of the other commissioners, Henry Clay in particular, enjoyed going out to coffee houses and playing billiards and cards. Again, from Trollope, quote, Clay had the room next to Adams, and at times, Adams would find himself waking just as Clay was going to sleep. Gallatin, meanwhile, worked to play peacemaker within the group, in particular doing what he could to soothe Adams in order to keep the mission going along. Once the British commissioners arrived, however, despite their differences in personality and habits, the American commissioners presented a united front. As noted by Perkins, quote, aside from one sharp conflict at the very end, the Americans agreed upon basic strategy, and they kept their arguments over language and tactics behind closed doors so that the British were unaware. The British Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, had initially thought to just send one diplomat to meet with the 5 Americans, but at a time where Britain's top diplomats were focused on the upcoming Congress of Vienna that had been called for following Napoleon's recent abdication, quote, to settle the problem of the European equilibrium, no one person could be found who embodied all of Liverpool's qualifications for the mission. Thus, he ultimately decided to send 3 commissioners. Dr. William Adams could provide legal expertise as an admiralty lawyer, while Vice Admiral Lord Gambier could speak to maritime affairs. George Hammond, the former British minister to the U.S., was initially chosen for the 3rd spot on the commission, but when Hammond declined the appointment, Henry Goulburn, an official in the Colonial Office, was tapped for the diplomatic mission. However, as noted by Perkins, quote, all 3 envoys were sturdy British nationalists of rather simple views. They failed to grasp the quandary of their masters, having no doubt about the proper course to follow. Neither did they possess the talents to meet the Americans in argument. Still, they were at least cordial in their dealings. Again from Perkins, quote, most meetings between the 2 commissions were models of sometimes over-elaborate decorum and cordiality. The 2 sets of negotiators occasionally dined one another throughout their stay, and Clay at least corresponded with Gambier and Goulburn in later years. Goulburn proved to be, quote, the most active English delegate at Ghent, but ultimately, the British commissioners, quote, rarely did more than parrot their instructions. While I won't go into all the ins and outs of the deliberations, it was clear on the second day of the negotiations, August 9th, that in terms of diplomatic talent, the Americans had the upper hand as, quote, the Americans led Goulburn and William Adams into embarrassing disclosures without giving away their own position. However, for the longest, it looked like there was no path to peace in these negotiations. The British were demanding an end to American fishing rights in the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland, something that had been granted in the Treaty of Paris at the end of the American Revolution, along with British control of the Great Lakes and a buffer state for the native allies of the British in the West. None of these terms were acceptable to the American commissioners, and indeed, they began to pack up to ready themselves to return home. However, the British kept coming back with new messages, and the Americans picked up on cracks in their arguments. Thus, they held their ground as the British kept coming back to them. Little by little, the British negotiators conceded one point after another. Then came word of the burning of Washington. The British government hoped that this news would weaken the position of the American negotiators and that they could get a treaty which would allow them to retain any American territory that they took prior to the agreement going into effect. However, the fact that they were also receiving word that some of their native allies had made a separate peace with the United States, as well as subsequent news of the disastrous Battle of Baltimore, quickly turned the tide once more. Then in stepped a pivotal voice that proved to be an unexpected ally. The celebrated British military commander, the Duke of Wellington, was approached by the Liverpool ministry about going to North America to take command of British forces there. Though Wellington considered the offer, he ultimately wrote on December 9th, declining the position. Not only did he think that there was little chance of military success there, Wellington warned the ministry that if they persisted in pushing for a peace on the concept of uti possidetis, that is, that each party retains what land it holds at the end of the war, the British would gain little, as they only possessed small bits of U.S. territory, while the Americans would gain a large portion of western Upper Canada that General Harrison had taken back in 1813. Wellington insisted that, if he went to America, his tenure would conclude with him, quote, signing a peace, which might as well be signed now. On the American side, as the British started giving way on one point after another, Henry Clay argued with his colleagues that they should insist on an article to end British trade with native peoples in U.S. territory. However, at this point, the other American commissioners just wanted to conclude a treaty on the basis of status quo ante bellum, which would remain silent on any issues still remaining between the U.S. and Great Britain, including impressment and the U.S.-Canadian border. Clay at one point asserted that, quote, I will never sign a treaty upon the status ante bellum with the Indian article, so help me God. Finally, though, Clay relented, and on December 24th, 1814, the British and American commissioners gathered at the residence of the British diplomats to sign what would come to be known as the Treaty of Ghent. Though the treaty signing meant that the war was potentially drawing to a close, there was still much more happening on the other side of the Atlantic which could potentially threaten the peace. In August, the citizens of Nantucket Island in Massachusetts, quote, formally declared their neutrality in return for relaxation of the British blockade. Then, in September, British troops captured part of Maine with relative ease. As discussed in episode 4.33, New England Federalists had already called for a convention of northern states to discuss the grievances that the region had related to this war with Britain that they hadn't wanted to begin with and increasingly threatened their livelihoods. The state governments were strained by ever-growing costs for defense now that the British were not exempting that region from the blockade or coastal attack as they had earlier in the war. With no relief coming from the federal government, leading regional industries distressed by wartime disruptions of business, and banks struggling to remain solvent, it was clear that something had to give. Thus, when 26 delegates representing 5 states gathered in closed sessions in Hartford, Connecticut in mid-December, New Englanders, as well as the federal government, could only watch and wait to see what would come out of that meeting. Meanwhile, the Madison administration had to turn their attention to another front in the war, as British Admiral Cochrane, after the retreat from the Chesapeake, had directed his fleet to head south to join up with forces already in the Gulf of Mexico. Cochrane in June had already set into motion an intended invasion of Mobile, which, as discussed back in episode 4.27, had been taken by American forces in April 1813. Cochrane planned for an overland march to Baton Rouge after the British took Mobile and linked up with native allies in the southeast. Once Baton Rouge fell, this would allow them to cut New Orleans off from the rest of the U.S., and, before long, all the lower Mississippi Valley and the Gulf South over to Georgia would be in British hands. In preparation for this, British Colonel Edward Nichols arrived in Spanish-held Pensacola on August 14th and effectively took control. As described by historian Frank Lawrence Owsley Jr., Nichols, quote, established a strict passport system to control travel and proceeded to recruit nearly all the local slaves for his black regiment. Nichols also issued a proclamation to the citizens of Louisiana to throw off the shackles of tyranny from, quote, a faithless, imbecile government, and deploring, quote, the American usurpation in this country. Nichols also made overtures to the pirate Jean Lafitte to join forces to overthrow the American government in Louisiana. As discussed in episode 4.29, Jean and his brother Pierre had no love for the Americans, as they had been putting pressure on their privateering operations in Barataria Bay. Still, as the British demanded that the Baratarians give up raids on Spanish ships, which was a key part of their business, and the Lafittes had no reason to trust that the British would actually live up to any bargain made with them, Jean declined the British outreach and would instead seek a full pardon from the United States in exchange for sharing with them what they had learned from the British during their negotiations and helping with the defense of New Orleans. Meanwhile, a new commander arrived to take charge of American military operations in Mobile. Having successfully concluded the Treaty of Fort Jackson on August 9th, as discussed in episode 4.31, General Andrew Jackson arrived and established his new headquarters in Mobile on August 27th. As noted by Owsley, quote, Jackson's view of the importance of Mobile, supported by the massive information from his intelligence network, was that Fort Boyer would be the first point of attack, and the general realized that its fall would lead to a cascade of events that would result in the loss of the Gulf South, including Lower Louisiana. Fort Boyer had been constructed on Mobile Point after American forces took Mobile in 1813 and was, quote, an earth and wood enclosed work armed with about 14 guns, built on a semicircular plan facing the sea with curtain walls and a bastion facing landward. Thus, the general had the fort repaired and readied, and as he had anticipated, British forces attacked Fort Boyer on September 14th. After 2 days of a repulsed attack, the British withdrew, and the fort, as well as Mobile, were still held by the U.S. With this defeat, the British decided to change up their strategy and instead strike at what was their main target to begin with. Even more crucial than Mobile for American control of the region was the city to the west, nestled in a crescent of the Mississippi River. It was New Orleans for all the marbles. But we'll have to wait to discuss the Battle of New Orleans next time, for our time together is drawing to a close. Special thanks again to Elsa and Chris of A Flat Pack History of Sweden, Peter of History Shorts, and Roberto of the History of Sarkevello, Georgia, and Czar Power for providing the intro quotes for this episode. And be sure to check out all their podcasts if you haven't already. Special thanks also to Christian of Your Podcast Pal for his audio editing work on this episode. If you'd like to enlist Christian's services for your podcast, check out his services at his website, yourpodcastpal.com. Thanks to the folks at the Colonial Music Institute at George Washington's Mount Vernon, who graciously allowed us the use of clips from Hull's Victory as performed by David and Ginger Hildebrand for our intro and outro music. You can find out more about the great work that the Colonial Music Institute is doing to research and share information about early American music and dance by going to mountvernon.org and typing in Colonial Music Institute in the search field. I'll have links to all these available on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find sources used in this episode, past episodes of the podcast, and links to much more information about all the American presidents. You can also find out how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the Presidency's podcast. Whether it's through a rating or review, or if you sign up as a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/presidencies, I cannot thank you enough for your support. Please feel free to reach out to me via email with any questions or comments at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy. Be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.